Millionaire seeks girl crying in the rain with a baby, and what they reveal next leaves him shocked. Who is the girl hiding in the shadows of a stormy night? Why is she so afraid? What secrets does the baby she clings to hold? As the millionaire delves deeper, a chilling mystery unfolds. What dark truths will he uncover at the old orphanage? Who can he trust when even the innocent seem to be in danger? With everything on the line, will he have the strength to face what lies beneath the surface? Prepare to be captivated, because the answers are more terrifying than you can imagine. The rain hammered down like the heavens had split open, each drop a stinging reminder of the storm raging both outside and within. Robert Harris tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his knuckles blanching as the car's tires struggled against the flooded streets. The city of Charlotte was a blur beyond the windows, streaks of neon light smeared into abstract paintings by the relentless downpour. Yet, despite the chaos, his thoughts were far from the road. They were tangled in the web of his life, a life meticulously built, yet utterly devoid of satisfaction. The wipers slapped rhythmically, battling the sheets of rain, but Robert barely noticed. His mind was elsewhere, lost in the cold corridors of his own making. Wealth and power had come easily to him, each victory more hollow than the last. He had scaled the heights of success, only to find nothing but emptiness at the top, a void that echoed with the sounds of his own loneliness. As the storm mirrored his turmoil, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing, something vital that had slipped through his fingers along the way. As he navigated the slick, deserted streets, Robert felt the isolation keenly. The world outside his luxury car felt distant, almost unreal, like a film he watched without participating in. He had been moving through life on autopilot, disconnected from the humanity that pulsed just beyond his reach. The decision to drive tonight had been impulsive, a rare departure from his carefully controlled routines. He needed to escape the suffocating silence of his mansion, the oppressive weight of his own thoughts. But now, as he turned onto a quieter road, the rain blurring the city's edges, he wondered if he had been running away from something deeper. And then he saw her. It was a fleeting moment, barely a glimpse through the sheets of rain. A small figure huddled against a lamppost, nearly swallowed by the night. Robert's foot hovered over the brake, indecision clawing at him. He could easily pretend he hadn't seen her, just another shadow lost in the storm. But something gnawed at him, a sharp pang of conscience he hadn't felt in years. He slowed the car, craning his neck to see through the fog-up window. The figure was clearer now. A young girl, no older than 10, soaked to the bone. She clutched something tightly against her chest, shielding it from the rain. It wasn't until Robert looked closer that he realized she was holding a baby, its tiny form wrapped in a threadbare blanket. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible over the drumming rain. Every instinct screamed at him to drive on, to leave this problem for someone else to solve. His life had no room for complications, no space for the chaos of other people's lives. But as he pressed the gas pedal, the image of the girl and the baby lingered in his mind, refusing to fade. He drove on for another block, his heart pounding in his chest. But the guilt was relentless, clawing at him with every turn of the wheel. It was as though the rain itself was urging him to turn back, to do something he hadn't done in years: care. With a sigh of resignation, Robert swung the car into a sharp U-turn, the tires skidding slightly on the slick pavement. He rolled back down the road, his car idling as he approached the spot where they stood. He rolled down the passenger window, rain splattering onto the leather interior. "Hey," he called out, trying to keep his voice steady despite the tremor he felt inside. "What are you doing out here in this weather?" The girl looked up, her face pale and pinched with fear. Her eyes, wide and glassy, were filled with uncertainty. We don't have anywhere else to go," she stammered, her voice trembling as much as her small frame. Robert's gut twisted at her words. This was far beyond anything he had dealt with in his business world. He knew he should call someone. Social services, the police, anyone more equipped to handle this. But the thought of leaving these children to the mercy of the night, of the storm that howled around them, made something inside him rebel. "Get in," he said, the firmness in his voice surprising even him. "I'll take you somewhere safe." The girl hesitated, clutching the baby tighter, her gaze darting between Robert and the car's interior. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice small. "We don't want to be any trouble." "It's no trouble," Robert replied, his tone softening. "You can't stay out here. Come on before you catch your death of cold." After a moment's hesitation, the girl nodded and carefully opened the car door, her small, soaked body slipping inside. Robert watched as she settled into the seat, her arms still wrapped protectively around the baby. Up close, he could see how thin and fragile she was, the weariness etched into her young features. The baby, too, was tiny, barely visible beneath the damp blanket, its small face scrunched in discomfort. Robert turned up the heat, hoping to chase away the chill that had settled in their bones. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Natalie," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "And this is Jacob. He's my brother." "Natalie and Jacob," Robert repeated, testing the names on his tongue. "I'm Robert. We'll get you somewhere dry." "Okay." Natalie nodded, her eyes scanning the luxurious interior of the car with a mixture of awe and suspicion. Robert could see she was used to being let down, and he couldn't blame her. The world had shown her too much cruelty for her to trust easily. As they drove through the rain-soaked streets, the storm outside seemed to retreat, leaving a strange calm within the car. The rhythmic thrum of raindrops on the roof became a soothing backdrop, a lullaby to the tension that had gripped Robert since he first saw the girl. For the first time in a long while, he felt as though he was doing something that mattered, something that went beyond the cold, calculated decisions of his daily life. They drove in silence for a few more minutes before Natalie spoke up again, her voice tentative. "Why did you stop for us?" The question caught Robert off guard. He didn't have a good answer, at least not one that made sense to him. "I don't know," he admitted after a moment. "It just felt like the right thing to do." Natalie didn't respond, but he could see her relax slightly, reassured by his honesty. The baby, Jacob, let out a small whimper, and Natalie gently rocked him, whispering soothing words. As they neared his home, a sprawling estate on the outskirts of the city, Robert couldn't shake the feeling that this moment, this decision to stop, would change something in his life. He didn't know how or why, but the emptiness that had plagued him for so long felt just a little less overwhelming. When they finally arrived, Robert parked in front of his large, empty house, suddenly aware of how stark and unwelcoming it must seem to someone like Natalie. The towering structure, with its cold stone facade and immaculate landscaping, was a far cry from the warmth she needed. He turned to her, offering a small, tentative smile. "Let's get you two inside and dried off." Natalie nodded, her eyes reflecting both gratitude and uncertainty. As they stepped out into the rain once more, Robert couldn't help but wonder if he had finally found a purpose, something, or rather someone, worth caring about. The rain had tapered off to a soft drizzle by the time Robert unlocked the front door, but the cold air inside his house hit like a wall. It was a stark contrast to the warmth he hoped to offer Natalie and Jacob. The house, grand and imposing, seemed even more lifeless now that he was bringing these two fragile lives into it. The high ceilings, polished hardwood floors, and expensive furniture only served to highlight how empty it all was. A museum of success, devoid of any true human connection. Natalie stood just inside the doorway, her wide eyes scanning the surroundings. She held Jacob close, the baby still bundled tightly in his wet blanket. Her expression was a mixture of awe and unease, as if she were an intruder in a place too grand for her to belong. Robert could see the hesitation in her steps, the way she moved as though she feared breaking something simply by being there. "This way," Robert said, leading them toward the living room. His voice was calm, but inside, He was scrambling to figure out how to make this place feel less intimidating, more like a sanctuary. He motioned toward the plush sofa. "You can sit here. I'll get some towels and something warm for you to wear." Natalie nodded, her eyes never leaving Jacob as she carefully sat down, her small frame almost disappearing into the oversized cushions. The baby stirred slightly but remained asleep, oblivious to the change in surroundings. Robert turned on the heat, hoping to chase away the lingering chill that clung to their clothes and skin. As he walked down the hallway to retrieve some towels and blankets from the closet, Robert's mind raced. He had never been responsible for anyone other than himself. His life had been built on efficiency, on making quick, decisive choices in business. But this was foreign territory, uncharted waters where he had no idea what he was doing. He returned with a couple of thick towels and a soft blanket, handing them to Natalie. "Here, use these to dry off. I'll see what I can find for you to wear." Natalie took the towels with a quiet "thank you," her voice barely audible. She began drying off Jacob first, her hands moving with a care and precision that seemed far too practiced for a girl her age. Robert watched her for a moment, struck by the tenderness in her movements. This was a child who had been forced to grow up too quickly, carrying burdens that no one her age should bear. He excused himself again to rummage through a closet, searching for anything that might fit Natalie. After a few moments, he found an old sweater and a pair of sweatpants. They were likely too large for her, but they were warm and dry, and that was all that mattered right now. When he returned to the living room, he offered the clothes to her. "These might be a little big, but they'll keep you warm," he said. Natalie looked down at the clothes, a flicker of hesitation in her eyes before she reached out to take them. "Thank you," she said again, her voice soft and polite. There was something in her tone that made Robert's chest tighten, a mixture of gratitude and caution, as if she was still waiting for the other shoe to drop. "There's a bathroom down the hall," he offered, pointing in the direction. "You can change there if you'd like." Natalie glanced at Jacob, then back at Robert, uncertainty clouding her expression. Can I take him with me?" she asked, her voice laced with anxiety. Robert blinked, surprised by the request. "Of course," he said quickly. "I'll wait here." She gave him a small, grateful nod before carefully picking up Jacob, balancing his small body on her hip as she stood. The baby stirred but didn't wake, his tiny hand clutching at the edge of Natalie's shirt. As she walked down the hallway, Robert watched her go, feeling a wave of emotions he couldn't quite name. This young girl was carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders, and he wasn't sure how to help her bear it. Left alone in the living room, Robert found himself pacing, the silence of the house now more oppressive than ever. What had he gotten himself into? These children needed more than a warm house and dry clothes. They needed someone who knew how to care for them, someone who could offer the kind of compassion and support that had been missing from his life for so long. But could he be that person? Could he fill that role when he had spent so many years closing himself off from the world? When Natalie returned, she was wearing the oversized sweater and pants, looking even smaller than before. The sleeves of the sweater hung past her fingertips, and she had to roll up the pant legs to keep from tripping. But there was something almost endearing about it, a reminder that despite everything, she was still just a child. "Do you want something to eat?" Robert asked, trying to think of what else he could do to make her feel safe and comfortable. Natalie nodded, looking slightly more at ease now that she was warm and dry. "If it's not too much trouble," she replied, her voice hesitant. "No trouble at all," Robert assured her, though inwardly he felt anything but certain. He wasn't used to cooking for anyone, let alone a child. But he couldn't very well ask her to do it. "How about some soup? I think I have some in the pantry." "That would be nice," Natalie said, her voice almost a whisper. As Robert busied himself in the kitchen, he found a can of chicken noodle soup and set about heating it on the stove. The simple task was oddly comforting, a small return to normalcy in the midst of the emotional storm that had been brewing since he first saw Natalie on the sidewalk. He could hear the soft murmur of her voice in the other room, talking to Jacob as she rocked him gently. It struck him how natural she was with the baby, how protective. He carried the steaming bowl of soup back to the living room and set it on the coffee table in front of her. "Here you go. Be careful, it's hot." Natalie smiled, a small tentative smile that made Robert feel a bit more at ease. "Thank you, Mr. Harris. Call me Robert," he said, sitting down in the armchair across from her. "No need for formalities." Natalie nodded, blowing gently on the soup before taking a sip. She seemed to relax a little more with each mouthful, the warmth spreading through her. Robert watched her eat, trying to find the right words to broach the subject that had been weighing on his mind since he found her. "So, Natalie," he began carefully, his voice gentle, "do you want to tell me what happened? Why were you and Jacob out in the rain?" Natalie hesitated, her eyes flickering up to meet his before dropping back to the soup. She fidgeted with the spoon, her hands trembling slightly. "We were kicked out," she said softly. "From the orphanage." "Kicked out," Robert repeated, his voice rising in disbelief. "Why? Who would do such a thing?" Natalie's grip tightened around the spoon, her knuckles turning white. "Miss Hannah. She's the manager. She said we were too much trouble." Robert felt a surge of anger, his hands clenching into fists. The idea that anyone could treat children this way was abhorrent. "Too much trouble," he echoed, his voice tight with controlled fury. "That's no excuse to throw you out in the middle of a storm." Natalie looked up, her eyes filled with sorrow and something else, something Robert couldn't quite name. "It's not the first time she's done it," she said quietly. "But this time, she said we couldn't come back." Robert's heart ached at the resignation in her voice, the way she spoke as if this was just another hardship to endure. He couldn't imagine what she had been through, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't let this continue. "Natalie," he said gently, leaning forward, "you're safe here with me. I don't know what's going on at that orphanage, but I'm going to find out. And I promise you, I won't let anyone hurt you or Jacob again." Natalie stared at him for a long moment, as if weighing the sincerity of his words. Finally, she nodded, a single tear slipping down her cheek. "Thank you, Robert," she whispered. For the first time in years, Robert felt something stir within him, something that went beyond the cold, calculated decisions of his business life. It was a spark of compassion, a desire to protect, to do something that truly mattered. As he watched Natalie carefully cradle Jacob while eating her soup, Robert realized that this moment, this struggle for compassion, might just be the beginning of something new, a purpose that could finally fill the emptiness he had carried for so long. The next morning, the house was bathed in the soft, golden light of early autumn. Sunlight streamed through the large windows, warming the polished wood floors and casting long shadows that danced across the walls. The storm had passed, leaving behind a fresh, crisp scent that mingled with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee. But despite the tranquil surroundings, Robert's thoughts were anything but calm. He sat at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee as his mind replayed the events of the previous night. Natalie and Jacob's plight had unsettled him more than he cared to admit. The sight of them, so small, so vulnerable, had triggered something deep within him, something that had been dormant for far too long. He had barely slept, his mind restless with questions and a growing sense of responsibility. The soft sound of footsteps broke through his reverie. He looked up to see Natalie standing hesitantly in the doorway, Jacob still asleep in her arms. She had changed back into her own clothes, now dry but still worn and tattered. Her eyes were wide with apprehension, but there was also a quiet strength in her gaze, a resilience that belied her young age. "Good morning," Robert greeted her, trying to keep his tone gentle. "Good morning," Natalie replied quietly. She shifted Jacob in her arms, trying not to wake him, though the baby seemed content to continue sleeping, nestled against his sister's chest. "Come in and sit down," Robert said, motioning to the table. "I made some breakfast." Natalie hesitated for a moment before carefully placing Jacob in a chair beside her and taking a seat. Robert slid a plate of scrambled eggs and toast in front of her, along with a glass of orange juice. "Eat as much as you like," he encouraged. She stared at the food for a moment, as if unsure whether it was really meant for her, then took a tentative bite. "Thank you," she murmured between mouthfuls, the hunger she had been trying to hide now obvious as she quickly devoured the meal. Robert watched her eat in silence, his thoughts once again returning to the night before. He knew he needed to understand what had happened to Natalie and Jacob to get to the bottom of whatever was going on at that orphanage, but he also knew he had to be careful, to approach the subject gently. Natalie had been through enough trauma, and the last thing he wanted was to overwhelm her. Once she had finished her breakfast, Natalie seemed to relax a bit more. Robert took the opportunity to start the conversation he had been rehearsing in his mind all night. "Natalie," he began, his voice soft but firm, "I want to help you and Jacob, but I need to understand what's happened. Can you tell me more about the orphanage, about why Miss Hannah did what she did?" Natalie's face tightened at the mention of the orphanage, her eyes dropping to the table. She fidgeted with the hem of her sleeve, clearly reluctant to speak. Robert could see the weight of her experiences pressing down on her, but he waited patiently, giving her the space to find her words. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maplewood it was supposed to be a safe place. At least, that's what they told us. But it wasn't." Robert leaned forward slightly, his attention fully on her. "What do you mean?" Natalie swallowed hard, her fingers twisting the fabric of her sleeve. "Miss Hannah, she didn't care about us. Not really. She only cared about the money." "The money," Robert repeated, a frown creasing his brow. He had heard stories of corruption in the foster system, but the reality of it, spoken from the mouth of a child, was far more chilling. "She would make us work," Natalie continued, her voice trembling. "Cleaning, cooking, doing laundry, all the things the staff were supposed to do. She said it was to teach us responsibility, but it was really just so she wouldn't have to pay anyone. And if we didn't do it right." Her voice trailed off, and Robert's heart tightened at the implication. "If you didn't do it right, what would she do?" he asked softly. Natalie hesitated, then finally looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and anger. "She would punish us. She would lock us in the basement, sometimes for hours, sometimes all night. And if we cried or begged to be let out, she'd make it longer." Robert felt a surge of rage, his hands clenching into fists beneath the table. The idea of children being treated this way, of Natalie and Jacob suffering at the hands of someone who was supposed to protect them, was almost more than he could bear. "Natalie," he said, his voice tight with controlled anger, "I promise you, I'm going to do something about this. No one should be treated like that, especially not children." Natalie's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back, her expression hardening with determination. "It wasn't just the punishments," she said quietly. "Sometimes, kids would just disappear." Robert's blood ran cold at her words. "Disappear? What do you mean?" "I don't know where they went," Natalie whispered, her voice shaking. "But one day they'd be there, and the next day, they'd be gone. Miss Hannah would say they were adopted, but no one ever saw them leave. And it wasn't like the kids were happy to go. They were just gone." Robert stared at her, his mind racing. If what she was saying was true, then this was far worse than he had imagined. This wasn't just neglect or abuse, it was something much darker. "Natalie," he said, struggling to keep his voice steady, "you're safe now. I'm going to make sure of it. But I need to know everything you can tell me about what's been happening at Maplewood. Anything you can remember, no matter how small, could help." Natalie nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "There were records," she said after a moment. "Miss Hannah kept them locked in her office. I saw them once when she left the door open. There were files on all of us, where we came from, who we were supposed to be. But some of the files, they were different. They didn't have names, just numbers. I think those were the kids who disappeared. Robert's mind was already working, formulating a plan. I'm going to need help with this, he said, more to himself than to Natalie. But I promise you, we'll get to the bottom of this. Natalie looked at him, a flicker of hope in her eyes. Do you really think you can stop her? Robert met her gaze, his resolve hardening. Yes, he said firmly. I will stop her. And I'll make sure no one else has to go through what you and Jacob have been through. Natalie nodded, her expression a mix of relief and lingering fear. Thank you, Robert, she whispered. I don't know what we would have done if you hadn't found us. Robert felt a lump in his throat, but he forced it down. You don't have to worry about that anymore, he said. You're not alone. Not anymore. As the morning sun continued to brighten the room, Robert knew that his life had taken a turn he had never expected. This wasn't just about charity or doing the right thing. It was about justice, about making sure that the most vulnerable among them were protected. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was doing something that truly mattered. As Natalie began to clear the table, Robert watched her with a sense of determination that he hadn't felt in years. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. He was going to fight for Natalie and Jacob, no matter what it took. Robert spent the rest of the day grappling with the enormity of what he had just promised. The morning's conversation with Natalie weighed heavily on him as he paced the length of his study, surrounded by symbols of his success. Awards, framed certificates, and photographs from corporate events. None of it mattered now. The faces of Natalie and Jacob, etched with fear and desperation, were seared into his memory, driving him toward a decision he knew could change everything. His instincts as a businessman told him that whatever was happening at Maplewood Children's Home was not just an isolated case of cruelty. There was something much larger at play, something dark and insidious that had been allowed to fester unchecked. But uncovering it would require resources and skills beyond his own. The sharp trill of the doorbell interrupted his thoughts. Robert glanced at his watch. It was late, nearing 8 in the evening, but he had been expecting this visitor. He walked briskly to the door, his mind still churning with plans, and opened it to reveal a tall man with a rugged appearance, dressed in a worn leather jacket and jeans. His hair was streaked with gray, and his sharp blue eyes betrayed a wariness that came from years of hard-earned experience. David, Robert greeted him, stepping aside to let him in. Thanks for coming on such short notice. David Collins, an old friend and a private investigator with a reputation for exposing corruption, nodded as he entered the house. You sounded pretty urgent on the phone, David replied, his voice gruff but not unkind. What's going on, Robert? You're not usually the type to get involved in things like this. Robert led David into his study, where they both took seats by the large mahogany desk. Robert sighed, running a hand through his hair as he tried to find the right words. I need your help with something, David. Something serious. David leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms as he waited. I'm listening. Robert began to recount the events of the past 2 days, starting from the moment he had seen Natalie and Jacob on the side of the road. He spoke slowly at first, but as the story unfolded, his words came more quickly, driven by the urgency of the situation. He didn't leave out any details, describing the fear in Natalie's eyes and the sinister implications of the missing children. David listened intently, his expression growing more serious with each passing moment. When Robert finished, there was a heavy silence between them, the gravity of the situation hanging in the air like a storm cloud. So, you think this Miss Hannah is running some kind of operation out of the orphanage? David asked, breaking the silence. I don't know what she's doing exactly, Robert admitted, his voice tinged with frustration. But I do know that something is very wrong at Maplewood, and those kids are in danger. David nodded slowly, his mind clearly working through the possibilities. If what Natalie says is true, then this is more than just neglect. It could be trafficking, illegal adoptions, or something even worse. Robert clenched his fists, his anger simmering just below the surface. "I can't just sit back and do nothing, David. I need to know what's really going on there. And I need to stop it." David rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "We'll need evidence, something concrete that we can take to the authorities. If we go in there half-cocked, we could tip them off, and they'll cover their tracks." Robert nodded, his mind already racing ahead. "That's why I called you. You have the skills and the experience to get to the bottom of this. I'll provide whatever resources you need. Money, contacts, anything." David gave a small, grim smile. "You always were the one with the resources, Robert. I'll start by digging into the orphanage's financials. If there's corruption, it'll show up in the money trail, and I'll need to get someone on the inside. Someone who can keep an eye on things without raising suspicion." Robert frowned. "Considering the challenges, how are you going to manage that?" David shrugged, a confident glint in his eyes. "I've got a few tricks up my sleeve. Don't worry about that. What you need to do is keep an eye on Natalie and Jacob. Make sure they're safe. If Miss Hannah realizes you're onto her, she might come looking for them." The thought of Miss Hannah or anyone else from Maplewood coming after Natalie and Jacob sent a chill down Robert's spine. "They're not going anywhere. I'll protect them." David nodded, his expression serious. "Good. In the meantime, I'll get started. I'll reach out to a few contacts and see what I can dig up. It might take a few days, but I'll keep you updated." "Thank you, David," Robert said sincerely. "I don't know what I'd do without you." David waved off the gratitude with a dismissive hand. "You'd do just fine. But let's focus on the task at hand. This isn't going to be easy, Robert. You're going up against people who won't hesitate to protect their interests, no matter who gets in their way." Robert's eyes hardened with resolve. "I'm ready for whatever comes. I'm not going to let those kids down." David gave him a long, appraising look before standing up. "I believe you. I'll be in touch." With that, David left, leaving Robert alone in the study once more. But this time, the silence wasn't as oppressive. Robert felt a sense of purpose, a determination that had been missing from his life for a long time. He was no longer just a wealthy businessman. He was a protector, an advocate for those who couldn't fight for themselves. As he sat back in his chair, he could hear the faint sounds of Natalie and Jacob in the other room, their voices carrying softly through the house. He knew that the road ahead would be dangerous, but he was ready. He had to be. For Natalie, for Jacob, and for all the other children who had been trapped in the darkness of Maplewood. Tomorrow, the investigation would begin in earnest, and Robert was prepared to do whatever it took to bring the truth to light. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of activity as Robert and David plunged headfirst into their investigation. David wasted no time digging into Maplewood Children's Home, and what he uncovered was nothing short of horrifying. The financial records were a tangled mess, with glaring inconsistencies that pointed to embezzlement and fraud. Suspiciously large donations from anonymous sources flowed through the orphanage's accounts, only to vanish without a trace. But the most damning evidence was the pattern of children disappearing from the system without any official documentation, a clear sign that something much darker was at play. Robert felt a growing rage as he read through the reports David sent him. How could this have gone unnoticed for so long? How many children had suffered because of this? The injustice of it all fueled his determination, but he also knew that confronting Miss Hannah and the people backing her would be dangerous. He couldn't do it alone, and he couldn't do it without a plan. Robert picked up the phone and dialed David's number. It rang twice before his friend picked up. "Robert, what's going on?" David's voice was calm, but Robert could hear the underlying tension. "I've seen enough, David," Robert said, his voice hard. "We have to act. We need to confront them now." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I was expecting you to say that," David replied. "I've already set up a meeting with a couple of key players in the city's administration, people who have a stake in Maplewood. They don't know we're onto them yet, so we'll have the element of surprise." Robert nodded, even though David couldn't see him. When and where? Tonight. I've arranged it at a private club downtown. They think it's a business discussion about potential investments, but we'll make it clear that they won't be investing in anything unless they explain what's really going on. Perfect, Robert said, his mind racing with possibilities. I'll be there. Robert, listen to me. David's tone was serious. These people are dangerous. They won't hesitate to protect themselves if they feel threatened. We need to be careful, and we need to make sure we have enough evidence to back up our claims. I understand, Robert replied, his resolve unwavering. I'm not backing down. David sighed, a sound of resigned acceptance. I figured you'd say that. Just be prepared for whatever happens. This could get ugly. I'll be ready, Robert promised. That evening, Robert dressed in his best suit, the one he reserved for important negotiations. But tonight wasn't just about business, it was about justice. As he adjusted his tie in the mirror, he thought of Natalie and Jacob, safe in their rooms upstairs. He had asked one of his trusted employees to stay with them while he was out, just in case. He couldn't take any chances. The drive to the club was short, but it felt like an eternity. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, planning out every possible scenario. By the time he arrived, he was focused, his emotions under tight control. He couldn't afford to let anger or fear cloud his judgment. David was waiting for him outside the club, leaning against his car with a look of steely determination on his face. You ready for this? David asked as Robert approached. As ready as I'll ever be, Robert replied. They walked into the club together, passing through the lavish foyer and up a set of stairs to a private room. The atmosphere was one of exclusivity, soft lighting, polished wood, and the quiet murmur of wealthy patrons enjoying their evening. But Robert barely noticed any of it. His mind was set on the confrontation ahead. Inside the private room, two men were already seated at a large table, both of them middle-aged and dressed in expensive suits. They looked up as Robert and David entered, their expressions polite but wary. Mr. Harris, Mr. Collins, one of the men said, standing up to shake their hands. Thank you for joining us. I'm Alan Bishop, and this is Edward Monroe. We're pleased to discuss the opportunities at Maplewood with you. Robert forced a smile as he shook their hands. Thank you for meeting with us, he said, taking the seat opposite them. David sat beside him, his gaze sharp and assessing. Alan and Edward exchanged glances before Alan spoke again. I understand you've taken an interest in Maplewood Children's Home. It's a worthy cause, and we believe there's significant potential for. Robert cut him off, his voice cold and direct. Let's not waste time, gentlemen. We both know this isn't about charity or potential investments. We're here to talk about the truth. The room went silent. Alan's polite smile faltered, and Edward's eyes narrowed. I'm not sure what you mean, Mr. Harris, Alan said, his voice carefully measured. Robert leaned forward, locking eyes with him. I mean the financial irregularities, the missing children, the illegal adoptions. I know what's going on at Maplewood, and I'm not going to stand by and let it continue. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then, Edward's lips curled into a sneer. You think you can come in here and throw around accusations without any proof? You're out of your depth, Harris. David, who had been silent until now, leaned back in his chair, his expression calm and composed. We have plenty of proof, Monroe. Enough to bring this entire operation crashing down. The question is, how far are you willing to go to protect yourselves? Alan's face turned pale, and he glanced nervously at Edward. This isn't what we agreed to discuss, Alan stammered. Robert cut him off again. You have two choices. Either you cooperate with us and help bring Miss Hannah to justice, or we take everything we have to the authorities and the press. You'll be ruined, and Maplewood will be shut down. So, what's it going to be? Edward's sneer faded, replaced by a look of cold calculation. You're making a mistake, Harris. You don't understand the people you're dealing with. This isn't just about Maplewood. It's bigger than you can imagine. Robert's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. Try me. There was a long, tense silence. Then Alan spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. What do you want from us? Robert exchanged a glance with David before replying. We want the full story. Who's behind this? How deep does the corruption go? And we want every document, every record, every name involved. Edward clenched his fists, his eyes burning with anger. But Alan, visibly shaken, nodded slowly. All right, he said, his voice trembling. But if we do this, you have to guarantee our safety. These people, they don't forgive easily. Robert nodded. If you help us expose the truth, we'll do everything in our power to protect you. But make no mistake, Alan. We're going to bring this to an end. The room was thick with tension. But Robert felt a sense of victory. This was the beginning of the end for Maplewood and the darkness that had festered within it for so long. The battle wasn't over yet, but for the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope. As they left the club, David turned to Robert with a grim smile. You handled that well. But remember, this is just the start. Things are going to get a lot more dangerous from here on out. I know, Robert replied, his expression resolute. But I'm ready for whatever comes. I won't let them get away with this. David nodded, his respect for his old friend clear in his eyes. We'll get them, Robert. Together, we'll bring this whole operation down. And with that, they parted ways, each knowing that the confrontation they had just begun would lead them deeper into a web of corruption and danger than they had ever imagined. But neither of them would back down, not until the truth was exposed and justice was served. The gravity of what Robert and David had set into motion began to settle in the following days. The deal they had struck with Alan and Edward was only the first step. Now, the real challenge was ahead. Unearthing the full extent of the corruption at Maplewood Children's Home and the powerful people behind it. Robert wasn't naive. He knew that by pushing forward, he and David were stepping into dangerous territory. Robert's nerves were on edge as he sat in his study late one evening, poring over the documents Alan and Edward had handed over. The evidence was damning. Proof of embezzlement, forged adoption papers, and links to an underground network involved in trafficking children. His hands tightened around the papers, the faces of Natalie and Jacob flashing in his mind. He couldn't let these monsters get away with it. The soft sound of a door creaking open pulled him from his thoughts. He looked up to see Natalie standing in the doorway, her eyes wide with worry. Mr. Harris, she said quietly, clutching the edge of the door. Is everything okay? Robert forced a smile, trying to hide the turmoil he felt. Everything's fine, Natalie. Just some work I need to finish up. She didn't look convinced, her gaze drifting to the papers spread out on the desk. Is it about Maplewood? Are you going to stop them? He sighed, setting the papers down. I'm trying, Natalie. I promise you. I'm doing everything I can to make sure no other children suffer like you and Jacob did. Natalie hesitated, then stepped further into the room. I'm scared, she admitted. What if they come after us? Robert's heart tightened at her words. He stood up and walked over to her, kneeling down to her level. I won't let anything happen to you or Jacob, he said firmly. You're safe here. I'll make sure of it. Natalie nodded, though the fear in her eyes didn't completely fade. Thank you, she whispered, before turning and heading back to her room. Robert watched her go, his resolve hardening. He had to stop these people, no matter the cost. The next morning, Robert and David met in the office of David's private investigation firm. The mood was tense as they went over the latest information. These documents are gold, David said, tapping a thick file with his finger. They confirm everything we suspected and more, but they also make it clear just how deep this runs. We're dealing with some powerful people, Robert. I know, Robert replied, his voice steady. But we can't back down now. We have to move forward. David nodded, but there was a cautious look in his eyes. I've been in touch with a contact of mine, a journalist who's been working on exposing corruption in the foster care system. She's willing to go public with this, but we need more. We need someone on the inside who's willing to testify. Robert frowned, thinking of Alan and Edward. What about them? They've already helped us. Couldn't they? No, David interrupted. They're too scared. They might hand over documents, but they won't stand in a courtroom or in front of a camera. We need someone braver, someone with nothing left to lose. Robert fell silent, his mind racing. Who could they turn to? Who would be willing to risk everything to expose the truth? Then a thought struck him, a risky, dangerous idea, but one that might work. What about Miss Hannah? Robert asked, his voice low. David looked at him sharply. You're not serious. She's the ringleader. Why would she ever turn on her own operation? Robert leaned forward, his eyes intense. Because she's running out of options. If we corner her, if we make it clear that we're going to expose everything with or without her, she might be desperate enough to turn on the people above her. She knows more than anyone else. If we can get her to flip, we'll have everything we need. David stared at him, weighing the idea. It's a long shot, he finally said, but you might be right. If we can put enough pressure on her, she might see betraying them as her only way out. Robert nodded. Exactly. But we need to be careful. If she gets even a hint that we're onto her, she could bolt, or worse, she could lash out. David sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. All right, let's do it. But we need to be smart about this. We can't let our guard down, not for a second. The two men spent the rest of the day devising a plan to approach Miss Hannah. They would need to isolate her, make sure she couldn't call for backup, and present her with the evidence in a way that made it clear she had no other option. As night fell, Robert couldn't shake the feeling that they were stepping into a lion's den. The people they were dealing with were ruthless, and if they felt threatened, they wouldn't hesitate to strike back. But he knew they had to take the risk. There was too much at stake, and too many lives had already been ruined. Later that night, as Robert prepared for bed, his phone buzzed with a message from David. We're meeting her tomorrow. 10 a.m. at the old warehouse near the docks. Be ready. Robert stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back, I'll be there. He set the phone down and gazed out the window into the dark, his thoughts heavy. Tomorrow would be a turning point, one way or another. Either they would finally break the corruption wide open, or they would find themselves in deeper danger than they had ever imagined. But no matter what happened, Robert knew he couldn't turn back. For Natalie, for Jacob, and for all the children who had been lost in the system, he had to see this through to the end. The early morning sun barely crept through the slats in Robert's blinds as he prepared for the most critical meeting of his life. The air was thick with anticipation, and the weight of what lay ahead pressed heavily on his chest. The previous day's research and strategizing had brought him and David to this pivotal moment, a face-to-face confrontation with Miss Hannah at the old warehouse near the docks. It was their chance to unravel the core of Maplewood's corruption. Robert dressed with practiced efficiency, his movements quick and precise, but the routine offered little comfort. His mind was spinning with the scenarios that could unfold, each one more dangerous than the last. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Come in, Robert called, his voice steady despite the anxiety gnawing at him. David entered, his face somber but resolute. Ready for this? He asked, though his tone carried the weight of what was unsaid. There was no turning back now. As ready as I'll ever be, Robert replied, fastening his cufflinks. Any last-minute updates? David nodded, holding up a folder. I've got a few more documents we can use to pressure her. If she's as desperate as we think, this might be enough to make her crack. Robert took the folder and flipped through the papers, his eyes scanning the damning evidence. Good. Let's make sure we're thorough. She's slippery. We need to keep our wits about us. With a final nod, they left Robert's mansion and drove toward the old warehouse. The building, abandoned and grimy, loomed on the horizon like a relic of a forgotten past. The location was perfect, discreet, isolated, and removed from prying eyes. As they approached, Robert noticed the determined set of David's jaw, a mirror of his own resolve. The warehouse's steel door groaned in protest as David pushed it open, revealing a cavernous space bathed in the dim glow of a single flickering bulb. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and decay, the perfect setting for a clandestine meeting. "Welcome," a cold voice echoed through the warehouse, sending a shiver down Robert's spine. Miss Hannah stepped into the light, her expression a mixture of disdain and curiosity. Her sharp features were softened only slightly by the lack of proper lighting, but her presence was as imposing as ever. "Miss Hannah," Robert greeted, his voice steady as he met her gaze. "Thank you for meeting us." She smirked, her eyes narrowing as she sized them up. "You're quite bold, Mr. Harris. I must say, I didn't expect you to get this far." David moved forward, his stance protective, his tone curt. "We're not here for pleasantries. We have evidence that implicates you and others in serious crimes. We're prepared to go public if necessary." For a moment, Miss Hannah's smirk faltered, but she quickly regained her composure. "And what makes you think I'm afraid of your threats? I've dealt with far worse." Robert took a deep breath, stepping closer. "We're not just threatening. We have documents, testimonies, and connections with journalists who are ready to expose everything. If you don't cooperate, you'll face the full weight of the law." Her eyes flicked to the folder in David's hand, a glimmer of uncertainty breaking through her steely facade. "You think you can scare me into submission?" "It's not about fear," Robert said, his voice low but intense. "It's about the truth. If you don't help us, we'll make sure the world knows what you've done. And that means no escape, no protection." Miss Hannah's gaze flickered with something Robert couldn't quite place. Fear, perhaps, or the realization of how precarious her situation truly was. She stared at the folder for a long moment before her shoulders slumped slightly in defeat. "Fine," she said abruptly, her voice tinged with resignation. "What do you want from me?" David exchanged a glance with Robert before speaking. "We need everything you know about the corruption at Maplewood. Names, documents, the whole operation. And we need it now. If you cooperate, we can offer you some protection. But if you don't, you're on your own." Miss Hannah hesitated, her face showing signs of internal conflict. "You think you can just waltz in and demand information?" Robert's tone softened slightly, recognizing the vulnerability behind her bravado. "We're not here to make demands. We're here to offer you a chance to redeem yourself, to make things right." The tension in the air was palpable as Miss Hannah weighed her options. She seemed to be caught between the fear of retribution from her superiors and the realization that her world was crumbling around her. Finally, she let out a long sigh and nodded. "All right," she said, her voice laced with bitterness. "I'll give you what you need. But you need to understand, I'm risking everything by doing this." David looked at Robert, a hint of cautious optimism in his eyes. "Let's get to work, then." Miss Hannah reached into her bag and pulled out a stack of documents, handing them over with a resigned expression. As Robert and David began to sift through the papers, she started speaking, her voice a monotone that betrayed both exhaustion and fear. She detailed the network that had been operating out of Maplewood, naming key players and revealing the extent of the corruption. Her words painted a picture of greed, exploitation, and the systematic abuse of power, with Maplewood at the center of it all. Each revelation deepened the horror of what they were uncovering, but it also strengthened their resolve. As the hours passed, Robert felt a surge of hope mingled with the tension. They were finally getting the information they needed, but the path ahead was still fraught with uncertainty. The corruption they were unraveling was vast and deeply entrenched, and the powerful forces behind it wouldn't take kindly to being exposed. When they had gathered everything they could from Miss Hannah, Robert and David knew it was time to go. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows through the warehouse's dirty windows. They had the evidence, But the battle to bring those responsible to justice was just beginning. As they left the warehouse, the weight of their mission settled heavily on their shoulders. They had taken a significant step forward, but the danger was far from over. The people they were up against were ruthless, and they wouldn't hesitate to strike back if they felt threatened. As Robert and David drove back to the office, the silence between them was thick with the unspoken understanding of the risks they were taking. But there was also a shared determination, a commitment to see this through, no matter what. David glanced over at Robert. "You did well today. It's going to be a long road, but we're making progress." Robert nodded, a determined look in his eyes. "We have a chance to make a real difference. For Natalie, for Jacob, and for all the children who are counting on us. We won't let them down." As they continued their drive, Robert felt a renewed sense of purpose. This fight against corruption, this battle to protect the innocent, this was what truly mattered. It was more than just a quest for justice. It was a path to redemption, a way to fill the emptiness that had plagued him for so long. He had found a new purpose, and he was ready to see it through to the end. For the sake of the children who had suffered, and for his own redemption, Robert would fight with everything he had.